Hello, this is John Pernay from Ion Annapolis and the Maryland Crabs podcast with a special election crab cake episode for your listening pleasure. In June, we held a mayoral forum that was very, very well attended, and you can, and quite honestly you should, go listen to that one, and you can find it on themarylandcrabs.com. But today, we bring you the voices of all of the other candidates running for Alderperson. Well, all but one of them. Republican candidate for Ward 1, Larry Clausen, did not respond to any of our requests. While we would have liked to have presented a forum or a debate with these 17 individuals, it just wasn't practical. So, we took it to the road so you can learn a little bit more about each of them in order to help us all make an informed vote. All of the questions were essentially the same to keep it fair, and we are releasing them all at the same time. Tune in and listen as your candidates answer some crucial questions about the city of Annapolis and how they plan to handle it should they be successful. Thanks for listening, enjoy, and be sure to vote. And we are back here again at the Commons, overlooking beautiful inner, outer, right on the border, the cusp of West Street, but we're right across from the Lighthouse Bistro. And today I've got another candidate for alderman, and this one is from Ward 2, and this is Mr. Kurt Riegel. How are you today?
I'm fine, John. Thanks very much for having me here, and thanks so much for running this podcast. It is a genuine public service. You have dragged our town into the 21st century.
And flattery will get you absolutely nowhere, okay? So we'll just go with that.
Well, maybe it's not a good thing to be in the 21st century. There are people in Annapolis that think that's a drawback.
Touche. Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, let's get right into it. But you ran for alderman in Ward 2 the last time around and narrowly lost your bid for that seat to the incumbent Alderman Fred Paone. You've been very active in the community, in the city. What specifically, when you focus on Ward 2, and for people that are listening that don't know, Ward 2 is West Annapolis, Admiral Heights, Homewood, Navy Academy Stadium, Growls, Clay Street, and you know that sort of general area. So it does go out, like the West Street Library is in Ward 2, I believe.
Yes, it's right at the boundary.
Right on the boundary. So that's sort of where it is, where it sits in Annapolis. But specifically into the ward, what do you see as the most pressing issue that your constituents are squawking about?
And most pressing is always a hard thing to do because the most pressing issue varies from person to person. But here are the ones that this is sort of the top 3 or 4 that I think are on people's minds and that need to be dealt with. First of all, Ward 2 is most of it in the Weems Creek watershed. That creek, Weems Creek, is very near and dear to the hearts of residents. There are a lot of boaters. We care about water quality. And I and a number of other residents of the city are doing what we can to keep that a nice place. There are threats that are coming up, particularly in the headwaters of Weems Creek, for development that's going to generate additional stormwater, additional siltation.
Now, are the headwaters in Ward 2?
The headwaters are partly in Ward 2, partly into the county. So this is a city-county problem in terms of stormwater generation.
So this is similar to what the Bay is facing with the Susquehanna coming down from Pennsylvania.
Yes. So the Weems Creek is really very important, and I will continue, as I have in the past, in working on watershed issues, watershed protection, and forest protection, which is forests are the most important protector of our waters, and that's why I've worked so hard in that area. Another issue in Ward 2 is the Naval Academy Stadium, which we have been dealing with, I think, increasingly recently. There are several issues. One is just an issue of being a good neighbor. They make noise sometimes, and the list of events has expanded over the decades to include more and more activities of more and more different types. That's not necessarily bad, but it is a change, and it's provoking some irritation among some residents. Without making any judgments about the pros and cons of particular types of events, I will say that the communication between the management of the Naval Academy Stadium and nearby residents has been less than it could be, and I will work very hard to see that communications channel is made more robust, and we get advance notice of things that are going to happen, and the community has a voice in shaping what happens there with the Naval Academy.
So that Hooters Restaurant Convention is probably not going to make it?
Probably not.
Go out on a limb there. Do you find that those same issues, the environment, the development, and the water, carry over into a citywide as well? Or is the city facing some additional or separate issues?
Water quality is a citywide issue. We have 4 creeks in Annapolis. Ward 2's creek is primarily Weems Creek, although we're also in the watershed of College Creek. And actually the watershed of Spa Creek. So yeah, we touch all 3 of those sub-watersheds. But it is a citywide issue. Sailing and the Chesapeake Bay are integral to the character of Annapolis. And so, yes, it's important citywide, and I think there's a citywide dedication to doing everything we can to not only preserve what we have, but to try to make things better.
Looking around the city, right now the big buzzwords are Eastport Landing over in Ward 8 and Providence Point, which is formerly Crystal Springs over in Ward 4, which has probably arguably the most impact on Ward 5. Not a whole lot of new development going up in Ward 2. I don't want to say you're built out, but I mean it's there. But where do you stand as one voice on the council on development in the city? Are we doing it right? What do we need to do?
Well, everybody is for something which is characterized by the buzz phrase smart growth. Nobody's against that, but there's a range of opinion on what smart growth constitutes. We came to Annapolis for 2 reasons. One was sailing, and the other was so that we did not have to depend on our car to get around everywhere. Annapolis has attributes that support both of those to some degree. But when I started sailing on the water, I found that the Chesapeake Bay that we live with here is less than the Chesapeake Bay that I knew as a child. Similarly, bicycle riding is a good thing. I came to this podcast today on a bicycle. But I have to tell you, it is a hazardous undertaking to get around Annapolis on a bicycle. So in terms of development, I would like to see that at least those 2 values are recognized and paid attention to. Water quality development ought to proceed in a way that protects forest and natural vegetation, which is our strongest protector of water quality. And secondly, that mobility, which is characterized not just by cars, not just by parking, but also public transport and bicycles and pedestrians, all of those things should be taken care of as well. And in my opinion, plans for development have not taken into proper account some of those factors.
I'm not seeing a Democratic sweep, and you are running as a Democrat in Ward 2, but I'm not seeing a Democratic sweep of the council and the mayor's seat, and I'm not seeing a Republican sweep of the council and mayor's seat this time. So you're going to have opposing parties working with you on the council. You are one voice on the council. The mayor gets a couple extra perks like an office and whatnot, but he is only a voice. How do you work with the folks on the other side of the aisle? I mean, you've got this little bit of a gap sometimes. How do you reach across the aisle as an alderman?
You know, John, for most issues, there are really not strong party components to differences between people. The mayor and members of the city council do have differences, but they are very seldom tied to what I would call party ideological differences. And that's a great thing for Annapolis. I'm so glad we are less like Washington than we might be if it got polarized and dysfunctional. So I think the starting point is that these are handled issue by issue. Personal relations are important, and ability to negotiate, talk out these things, and strike a compromise that works not for the members of council, but for most of the constituents is how we have to do this. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And now I have to tell you, some of these national ideological things have crept into city council discussions, and there is a distinct difference between me and the incumbent in Ward 2 on one particular point. The non-discrimination ordinance was proposed and hotly debated, and the only 2 votes on that non-discrimination ordinance were Republican. And I take that to be a reflection of national ideology rather than local need. The mayor himself, for example, said that his reason for voting against it was fear of losing grants from the Trump administration. And I think the proper way to run a city is not to operate out of fear, but to do the right thing for the people who live here.
That'll lead me right into the next question. So apparently you're like cheating and looking at the questions on my on my thing. But as you look back, and you followed the council and the administration, this one and the last one where Mayor Cohen was here. But let's focus right now on Mayor Panellides' administration and the council. I don't want to throw it all on the mayor. But what do you look back on the last 4 years and go, oh my gosh, why the hell did they do that? And there's no way I ever would have done that. What was the biggest boneheaded mistakes this council has made?
Well, that's a very interesting one. Let's see, I hadn't thought about that. There are lots of mistakes that I would call little mistakes, but whether they're sweeping, overarching, and I can't really say. I do think that the big failures are failures to invest in areas that would make this town a lot better. And I'm talking about those things that are components of vitality, things that make Annapolis a place where people like to live and people want to come and visit. The city dock situation, it's not in Ward 2, but it affects everybody in the city.
Certainly.
And I think it is so much less now than it could be if we could somehow get the don't change anything mindset behind us and really work to make that a truly attractive place that brings people in. Good for business, good for the people who live here, and just nice, makes the town nicer. Another thing that I think the mayor and the city council have been short on is taking care of non-tax revenues. We're paying a lot of property taxes in the city of Maryland. And in my opinion, other users of city services are not contributing their fair share to the burdens that we bear. The state government, for example. There are tax laws, they have exemptions that are created at either the federal or the state levels. The city doesn't have a lot of influence over that, but we do have some influence. And one is to go to the state and the county and some of these larger nonprofits and try to negotiate better fees in lieu of, or payments in lieu of taxes. The Naval Academy Stadium is one of those things. They are skating free on virtually all taxes. And it's a multi-million-dollar operation. It's a major element of the economy of Annapolis. And I think they use police services, they use a number of other city municipal services, and I think that a more equitable payment to the city in terms of the burden they are placing on us is reasonable, notwithstanding their tax exemptions.
We've made the argument, depending on which day of the week it is, the argument's been made that the city is in financial straits and the city is financially sound. Let's for a moment just say that the city is in horrible shape financially. We're on the verge of bankruptcy. Let's suppose we are really on our last leg. How, as an alderman, do you start to look how to sort of right this ship that's going under?
Well, the proposition that we are either in great shape or bad shape, those two opposing propositions, in fact, are both true in varying degrees. To start with the bad side, yes, we have some elements, structural elements in the city financial picture that need to be addressed. One of those is the pension situation. And there is a growing deficit in what we need to do to provide for the pensions that we have agreed to by contract with city employees and public safety employees and so forth. That has to be attacked either by greater city contributions or greater cost sharing in the various elements of those pensions, health benefits, and so forth. It's a difficult problem. I don't have a solution, but I know that it's something that's got to be tackled. I mentioned the pilots from nonprofits and other governments. That is a very good way to address the looming deficits that we see before us. it is true that the debt that the city has been taking on, long-term debt, has been growing over the past 4 years. In fact, a little bit longer than that, because we were in a recession. And I have no problem with going to the banks for debt when you really need it. And typically those needs arise during depressions, recessions. Sure. I do have a big problem in going to the money lenders when the economy is good, and it's pretty good right now, and accumulating a long-term debt, basically for current expenditures. We're now up to a debt-to-revenue ratio of something like 1.5, and that is uncharacteristically high for cities of this type. A more typical value is around 1 or so. So we're sort of 50% more indebted than we ought to be, and we should be working at getting that down and using money which is borrowed for true long-term capital expenditures, not for operating expenses.
Is everything on the table, or is nothing on the table?
In my opinion, the taxes, property taxes, for example, are approximately the right level now. But I do think that we're not taking advantage of revenue sources that could avoid the need for going to the taxpayer for more. And those things are fees. The nonprofits, for example, use many city services. And it is legal, although we cannot tax nonprofits, it is legal to charge them fairly for the services they use. And I would like to see that we do a re-examination of those fees to see whether they are properly priced. We have a property tax sharing ratio. Annapolis residents pay taxes which are composed of two components, one to the city and one to the county. There's a ratio between those two, and I'm not sure that ratio is fairly computed. I'd like to go over that and make sure that the county is really carrying its fair share.
You know the job, apparently. How many hours, how much time do you expect to spend on this volunteer position? And in every one of these interviews, I've said it's a volunteer position because the position of alderman earns $14,000 a year, woefully undercompensated for the work that's certainly expected and the work that you would do. So I would like to say that's sort of a stipend that maybe helps cover some of your expenses associated with it. But how much time do you plan to invest in this position should you be successful in taking the seat?
Sadly, I've found people that feel that $14,000 to $15,000 is overpayment. But if you look into what most members of the city council do in terms of their investment of time, the good ones, it's essentially a full-time job. It's nearly an unpaid full-time job, and it works out to much less than minimum wage for this. So we're not doing this for the money. I expect this to be virtually a full-time job. Now, I can do that because I'm retired from my prior professional engagements, and I have the luxury of doing that. But that actually brings up an important point. You look at the people that are on the city council now, and they are primarily people who are either have independent sources of income or are retirees. And this is very much in accordance with sort of the history. The members of the council are called aldermen. It's English. The alderman was the wise old person that you turn to for counsel because they've been around. They know more than the young whippersnappers. Well, I don't think the world works that way. There are a lot of smart young people who do not engage in public service because they can't. They're raising a family. There's no salary. And some governments have recognized this. The county, Anne Arundel County, for example, pays members a little bit more. But I am distressed that we don't have a diversity. I mean, Jared is the only person on the council who has a full-time job, really.
Ian.
And, oh yeah, he's doing his...
Ian Pfeiffer as well.
Yeah.
So how do you specifically plan to keep your constituents up to date, involved, notified about what's going on? I know some aldermen do the town halls, and some, I swear, are using tablets and chisels. And what specifically do you feel are the effective means to communicate your thoughts, the thought and the vibe of your constituency and everything else to everybody else?
To me, John, this is one of the most important things about our Ward 2 representation that I want to fix. I don't think the communication between our Ward 2 representative and the voters and residents of Ward 2 are nearly as robust as they could be. And here's what I'd like to do. We actually have two very good examples on the City Council of people who communicate the following to their constituents electronically, using Facebook, using email distribution, all of these things, which are not presently being used in Ward 2. And those communications ought to alert residents to things that are coming up in future council meetings, issues and legislation which is coming up. They ought to indicate preliminary indication. They ought to indicate a preliminary stance by the alderman on how he will vote when that issue does come up. And they ought to provide a means for constituents to get back to the alderman to supply him with facts and arguments that will sway his vote one way or another. Those things are not happening now, and so I intend, as sort of the highest priority, is to establish communications channels using modern electronic media, email and social media. You know I'm already engaged in right now. And then also to have physical events like town halls. I think it's very important. And to my knowledge, Ward 2 has never had a town hall, ever. And I would like to have these things periodically so that their representative and the constituents are closely in touch.
Good. All right, let's get a little philosophical here as we start to wrap up. They say, and it's been said for years and years, that there are two Annapolises. You've got typically wealthy white landowners down on the waterfront manses, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got low-income public housing, assisted housing, Black, Hispanic communities that are struggling to make ends meet here in the same city that we all call home. We do have this gap in the middle. We've got this wide chasm. What do you do to start to close that? What are your thoughts on how to close that down so we can get closer to one Annapolis that everybody is really, I think everybody agrees that we need to have?
Isn't it interesting that the people who are at the top of the income scale live close to the water now, when 200 years ago it was not the case at all? That was the undesirable land. We are one Annapolis, and too often we lose sight of that fact, and people and government behaves in a way that doesn't recognize that fact. Annapolis is afflicted by the same problem that we see nationally, and that is a growing disparity between those at the high and low income end of the spectrum. Virtually every metric that you look at shows that gap is widening. And it's a problem. You can do a little at the city government level to address this, but perhaps I think it would be very ambitious to say we can solve the problem, but there are some things we can move in the right direction on. I think public housing in one form or another is always going to be with us, because there will always be a segment of the population, for reasons that are mostly not their own fault, are either afflicted with physical or other problems that make it basically impossible for them to earn at high levels. So they need help, and I have no problem with helping out people. Much of that help, financially speaking, has come from the federal government up to now. HUD grants and so forth have carried a major portion of the cost of providing public housing. That's in jeopardy. With the Trump administration, that's likely to dial down. And so this is a problem that Annapolis is going to have to come to terms with. I don't have a solution now, but I do recognize it as a significant and growing problem, and it's something we ought to have our eye on and start to make plans for. The first plan is to work with our federal representatives to see that those federal support dollars keep flowing toward us, because we need them. And in terms of the divide is also contributed to socially. And I think it's very important that city events and cultural events, that whenever we do anything in the city of Annapolis, we do everything we can to make those events inclusive of people, certainly at the low end of the income spectrum, but everybody, so that we all feel as though we have common cause. Now, I've run into this problem of in another context. In terms of bay water quality, we had a great difficulty in enacting the stormwater tax to take care of, well, doing the things that you need to restore land. And one of the reasons for that was a lack of commitment by most of the people. It used to be that people could go down to the water and spend there was some physical connection to the water. Everybody thought that the water was theirs. But now the water, 96% is closed off by private fences, and there's very little public access to water. And unless everybody feels as though they have a commitment to the waters that are the essence of Annapolis, we're not going to solve the problem. So I think an inclusion of everybody is really important.
Well, it kind of brings us to the end now. I would like you to tell me a little bit about your background, why you think you're qualified to do this job, why you want the job, but why you? Give me the pitch. Why do I vote for Kurt Riegel, Democrat, for Alderman in Ward 2?
Well, here's the way I feel about it. First of all, I'll start with a little of my background. I'm a scientist. I went to Johns Hopkins and got a BA in physics, and then went to grad school at the University of Maryland in College Park, and emerged with a PhD in astrophysics. And I did observational radio astronomy for an entire career.
Rocket scientist.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I taught at the University of California. I did research in several national observatories. Spent a year in Holland doing astronomical research there. And I saw there in Holland, they think of transportation in different terms than we do. The bicycle is an essential element of Dutch transportation. We regard the bicycle as recreation, not transportation. And I would like to do what I can to make Annapolis a place where the bicycle can again become a part of our transportation system, not just a recreational activity. So that's my first career. My second career started in the first energy crisis. I really got interested in energy efficiency and environmental problems connected with the consumption of energy. And on one of my trips back to Washington, I'd heard about this guy named Jack Gibbons, who had just set up an energy efficiency office in the White House. It was different in those days. You could walk up to the old executive office building without an appointment, without knowing anybody, without an ID, and say, I'd like to see this guy I heard about, Jack Gibbons. And I did, and I was said, oh, he's on the second floor, go see him. So I went on. We had a fascinating conversation, which devolved into an invitation to lunch in the White House. And by the time that lunch was over, I had my first job in Washington, in the Federal Energy Office. And that's where I really got a taste of the intersection between science and public policy, because we found ourselves faced with an energy crisis, saying, look, we're the government. Is there anything we can do to help? And we did do some things that were helpful, and some maybe not so much. But one of the things I did, have you ever seen those yellow tags that are on every appliance for sale?
Yeah, the energy, this will cost you $20 a year to run.
I drew the first one. The motivation behind that was that people were making short-term decisions that have long-term consequences, and there was no way of communicating what the long-term consequences of those short-term decisions were. People were buying appliances on price rather than total cost of operation over their lifetime. And so we thought it would be helpful to national energy efficiency to communicate that long-term consequence. And so I came up with that label, and it's now on every appliance by law. So that was one thing. Another thing that I did in that job was to work on lighting. I somehow got assigned lighting because, hey, I'm an astronomer, I must know something about light. And
right.
So that's what I started with. I said, the light bulb is really inefficient. You know, like 1 or 2% of an incandescent light bulb's energy turns into light. The rest of it is heat and is wasted. So I sponsored the very first federal R&D program on an alternative form of lighting called the compact fluorescent bulb. And the big three lighting manufacturers all said, well, this is ridiculous. We have a huge investment in incandescent bulbs. We make them very cheaply. This will never go anywhere. But we persisted. And sure enough, within the next year, they all started their own R&D programs. And what emerged was it wasn't the very first concept that I funded. Right. It never is the first one. But what happened was that we spawned interest and activity within the industry itself, and they came up with some good solutions. And the solution was the compact fluorescent bulb. So that's my background. That's enough of that. That's how I got interested in public policy. And I went from there to the Environmental Protection Agency, and I was involved in the technical basis for environmental regulation. And then I went back to astronomy. I became head of the National Astronomy Centers all over the country, in Chile, in Puerto Rico, in New Mexico, in West Virginia. So I was in charge of that for a while. And then had an opportunity to go back to environment. So I've always been somewhat schizophrenic. I like science, I like environment, and I had a chance to go back to the environment again. Well, I worked at EPA writing regulations. Mm-hmm. Now I went to the Department of the Navy, and my job was complying with those regulations. So I've worked on both sides of the regulatory fence. Okay. I know the problems of both creating regulations and the problems of complying with them. So I think, just to sum it up, I think that a fairly broad professional experience in a number of different areas has equipped me with a capacity to handle a variety of complex problems here at this level. The municipal level is fascinating. I love Annapolis. It's you're working with people, with all sorts of wonderful people, quirky people, little contention here and there. And I think it's wonderful to step down from these lofty national policy ideas and deal with people at more tangible. I have two motivations. One is personal, and that is just to become well connected to a community that I love. And the second is to do something about it and try to make this a better place. And I think I have some ideas for doing that.
Well, very good. Now, where can people find out more about you?
Well, I have a website.
What they've learned in this, and if you've got anything coming up, just let them know. Your address, your car, whatever it is you want to tell them.
Okay. Two things. I have a website. Its address is kurtriegel.com, and everybody misspells it, so I will spell it for you.
You should buy all the different variations.
That's true. It's KURTRIEGEL.com. And then there's a Facebook page for the campaign, and then I have a personal one. It's often difficult to tell the difference between the personal and the campaign page, but I do have one of each. And in terms of events, the most significant one that is coming up is a fundraiser / meet and greet. I'd like people to come in, support me if they feel I'm doing good things, but just meet and talk. Otherwise, that's going to be on August 21st at 6 p.m. On the Severn River in the community of Wardorf. And it'll be a wonderful event. Everybody's invited, and I hope they will come.
More information on that on your website and Facebook page as well?
Exactly.
Okay, well, that is, to reiterate, it's KURTRIEGEL.com. And we are here at the Commons with Kurt Riegel, who is a candidate for alderman in Ward 2, which is sort of West Annapolis area. And thank you very much for coming out.
It's a pleasure, John.
So there you have it. Answers from a candidate or alderperson in the city of Annapolis. Did they answer anything that was on your mind? If not, make sure you get in touch with them so you can make the best vote come September 19th in the primary election. Be sure to keep up to speed on the election at eyeonannapolis.net and also on the marylandcrabs.com. It is an important election this year, so it is so important to get out and vote. And speaking of voting, the primary is on September 19th and the general election is on November 7th. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And after the primary, look for an announcement from us about a mayoral debate between the two survivors. Just like the forum in June, Eye on Annapolis and the Maryland Crabs will bring this to you, but this time it'll be structured more as a debate rather than a forum. Thank you for listening to this special election crab cake episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Maryland Crabs podcast. We have fresh stuff that drops every Thursday at noon.